Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm back here in Ark. I'm over here at my base on Ragnarok. I had a discussion with some people on Reddit today about pillars and what their purpose is, what kind of people use them, and it got me thinking about different moral principles and how they're represented in the game. I thought I might kind of share some thoughts on, which they're kind of interesting. This game it's a survival game. It's kind of based on like a harsh version of Earth, sort of. It's rugged, it's harsh. There's wild animals everywhere. Survival is not guaranteed. You will die. You can die, but the difference is you can respawn on this game. So death isn't as final, but it still sucks. It's still an inconvenience, and it looks like I'm about to do it right now. Holy shit! Oh, I barely survived. So you shouldn't usually dance around on the railings of your base on top of a cliff if you want to survive. But if you do and you have 500 health, you just might live anyway. Anyway, that's not what I'm talking about, though. What I'm talking about is moral principles and how they're kind of represented in the game, including pillars, which I think is a representation of the concept of homesteading and property rights. I'll get to that later, though. But yeah, this game's really interesting. Yeah, it's a harsh survival game. Like I was saying, survival's not guaranteed. You gotta do for yourself. You gotta work for your own needs. You gotta get after it. You gotta put some effort in. You gotta mix some labor with the land. You gotta make claims. You gotta do stuff. You gotta provide for your needs, or you will die. I think there's a certain justice in that, honestly. Survival is not guaranteed. No species besides humans has ever remotely approached a state of survival being remotely guaranteed. And people like to think that it is now because we have a lot of luxuries, but we didn't just magically get those luxuries. They didn't just drop out of the sky. They had to be produced. They had to be produced by generation after generation of hardworking human beings, just like you, that had more or less the same capabilities physically and mentally that you do. But they didn't have the infrastructure that you have. They didn't have the luxury that you have. They had to build it piece by piece, layer by layer, over the generations. And that's what this game is about, is similar, a progression. You start with nothing. You start with your fists, and you gotta punch trees and build stone tools, and you keep progressing to the point where you literally have high-tech sleeping chambers that you can get in, and they auto heal you after you fall off your base because you're clumsy as hell. So it's a really awesome game. It's got a lot of levels to the progression, and I think they all kind of have similar parallels to things in real life, like the different tiers of technology and capabilities that you progress through. They all have real life representations, even the dinosaurs, which you wouldn't think so, but they do. You get a fast moving mount. It's similar to having a fast moving vehicle. You get a dino that can tear up a whole assload of metal or cook it for you or haul it for you. It's similar to having the infrastructure that would do the same sort of things, like a big drill or a backhoe or a dump truck. It's the same kind of stuff. These animals, they all have utility value, similar to real life equivalents, except for these but they're much more personable. They got hilarious faces. You can raise them from babies. They add a lot more sentimental value, which I think makes the game very charming. But yeah, you can't ignore the utility value of some of these animals. They're amazing. And so if you're playing this game and you're not advancing through these levels, you're doing it wrong. But if you're also not respecting the meaning of how you're going about doing that, you're missing an important piece. And people often do miss this important piece, this important concept. They just take it as a given, or they think they're entitled to it. But none of these things are entitlements in this game, except for respawning. And even that's not necessarily guaranteed to be in a good spot. You could respawn in the floor, you can respawn in some guy's base, or you could respawn in front of another hungry mouth. So but you can just keep respawning. So it's a lot of fun. It takes some of the edge off, but yeah, it's really cool. I've rambled on enough about that. I want to talk about some of the principles. I'll start with the concept of self-ownership. It's the idea that you own your person, your avatar, so to speak. You own it in the game. You own it in real life. Your human body is essentially your avatar for the physical world, and you have similar exclusive control over it. Like my character in the game, nobody else's controller is plugged into it. Nobody else can move it around. Nobody else can direct it to their will like I can. And it's the same with your human body. You know, nobody else has more mastery over your human body throughout your life than you do. And the only way that anybody could have any temporary mastery over your human body is by using theirs. And so if they're using their claim on their body to undermine your claim on your body, it's certainly not mutual. It undermines your ability to live. And if we're to agree that we can live in a mutually harmonious way of any sort, and that it's right that we try to pursue that, then we have to accept certain conclusions from that. And I think that we can't easily assume that, because as a social being capable of division of labor and trade, pretty much anybody recognizes that we have far more to gain from society by working with society than by trying to get by preying on everybody else in society. You're much more likely to be killed if you put yourself at odds with all of humanity. They're going to determine you're a risk, you're a threat, you're a danger, and they're going to, you know, take you out accordingly. Or they're going to put you in a cage accordingly. So you have that basic choice. I mean, it's out there, but I think any reasonable person would agree. If the options are living in a mutually harmonious way, a mutually needs-meeting, voluntary way with the rest of society, or trying to get by on everybody else by using violence to impose your will against theirs for your benefit at their expense and at your risk, most people choose to try to work within society. Even if they do have criminal tendencies, they don't make them overtly known. They try to do it in secret. They try to do it without the rest of society recognizing their crime and trying to stop them, because that makes the risks go far up. You know, the only way that most people realize that any level of crime is remotely practical is if it's done as secretly as possible, with as few of the victims realizing the harm you've done them as possible, so that they don't bring any retribution on you. I'm not advocating crime in any way, by the way. I'm just saying people who do in any way try to consider it in any reasonable way recognize pretty quickly that the less people know about your crime, the better. Preferably that goes all the way down to zero. So nobody knowing about any crime. And if nobody knows about any crime you've done, is it really crime? That's the question to wonder. Because if nobody's recognized any harm you've done them, is it really harm? Because in order for it to be understood as harm, it should also be recognized as harm. So let's say somebody has property, and according to the law, you're trespassing on it. You've trespassed on their land, but you left you didn't break any twigs, you didn't steal any rocks, you left no sign of no clue that they didn't even notice you even trespassed. So have you harmed them at all? I would argue you haven't. A harm unnoticed isn't a harm, probably. I guess there's things that people might not notice that are still harm, but and I think there's something to be considered there. Anyway, that's not what I'm really talking about, though. I was talking about self-ownership, and yeah, as a concept, I think it's pretty understandable, pretty obvious to see how it's supported. One thing that you can do is you can give it the self-contradiction test. Does the rule contradict itself in any way? And I don't see it as contradicting itself. In fact, it's the opposite. In order for someone to argue against self-ownership, they have to assert their own right over their own person, to use their own mouth, to make their own arguments, which I'm sure they would call their argument. They wouldn't deny it's their mouth that they're spewing their argument from. So how then could they claim that they don't own their mouth or their argument or their thoughts or their mind or their body? It's immediately self-contradictory. You literally can't argue it against it without also supporting it. And you can't claim to have the right over another person without also claiming to have a right over your own body. So that breaks the mutuality concept of rights, which we've already established. If we're talking about societal rights here that are supposed to lead to the best outcomes, the right way to survive, so to speak, then they should be mutually practicable by all people at all times. And you can't own other people as property if you're not allowed to also own yourself. And you can't own yourself mutually while everybody else owns themselves while also owning them. That's not how ownership works. Ownership is the concept that you have the mutual right to control. You have the exclusive right to control something. So yeah, it just doesn't. Definitionally, it doesn't make any sense. It explodes on itself. But we also use the word property. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Property, like I said, is the exclusive right to control something. And self-ownership inherently has to also include the concept of property, because your body is essentially being, treated as a form of your own personal property in that formulation. But what else do you need? What else is necessary to be under this property umbrella? Because I would argue, and many have argued, that there is much more that is necessary to be included as right for you to be able to own. Because as a material body, as a physical body, or as this virtual body in this virtual game, you have needs. You have needs of the resources in the world. You have to have a place to put your stuff. You have to have a place to put your animals. You have to have a place to put your actual person, where they won't die every time you log out. You have to be able to protect yourself. You have to feed yourself. You have to give you have to get water. You have to do all these things. You have to take care of all your needs. They're physical needs in the physical world. They're these virtual resources in this virtual world. They're the same parallel though. And so yeah, you're gonna need property. That's where the justification for property ownership comes from. And there's an unlimited number of ways to use property, all forms of property. There's ways that we haven't even conceived of to use forms of property we haven't even understood to be important yet. And there's always new ways that people are realizing that things might be important to use in an exclusive way, like radio frequencies, for example. People didn't know about radio waves. They didn't know about sending radio signals through, RF bands and stuff like that, some hundreds of years ago. So nobody owned any radio waves, no radio frequencies. There was no bands that were considered like for exclusive use for certain purposes or certain people. It wasn't considered a form of property, because there was no use for it. There was no value for it. There was no scarcity, and there was no knowledge of it, really. But then later on, people figured out, hey, you could use these frequencies in these certain ranges. You can send these signals. But if everybody else is doing the same thing at the same time on the same frequencies, it's not going to work. So it's a scarce resource. It's going to lead to contention. It's going to lead to conflict, unless we can figure out a way of reserving some exclusive rights to use certain range of this band. It's the exact same way with property in all its forms. It's just a form of property, and that leads us back to this concept of these pillars. This is basically just a way of claiming a form of property in the game, land. You need land in the game. You need to be able to build things. You need to be able to put down infrastructure. You need to be able to travel. You need to be able to harvest resources from the land. And the only way to protect any of those uses is with these pillars. Because if you don't, somebody else is going to take that spot, and you're not going to be able to use it for what you need to use it for. And some uses only one person can make use of it. Like if somebody makes a big base, they lock all the doors, nobody else is going to get in there. Nobody else can use it. Like nobody else can use the inside of my base right now. I've got all the doors locked. So if there was some important resource that was here and everybody else might wanted to use it, they needed to get here and reserve it by putting these pillars down to stake their claim, or else I would have come along and put this up. There was no resources here. The only great thing I found to use with this piece of land is to build an epic base with an epic view. Fortunately, I got here first and claimed it first, which leads us to the next concept related to property rights, which is homesteading. It's the concept that the first person to get to a spot and mix their time, their effort, their labor, their expertise, and their resources in a way that adds value to that land is the owner. You're the first person. You're the homesteader. Your first claimant. And that's essentially what pillars are on this game. Any structure you place down is a form of homesteading. You place it down, you've made the claim. You've mixed your time and effort and your labor. You have to learn the engrams to build the certain structures. You have to get the materials to craft the structure. And you have to place it down. All these things add some value already, because now you have the potential. The more interconnected land you have, the more you can do with it in that one spot. You've added value, and you've made a claim, an exclusive claim on the land. It's a very valuable tool. This is a concept that's been understood for hundreds of years. Concept of homesteading, staking a claim. There's different forms of it. There's different places that you stake the claim. There's different record keepers that will keep the track of it. But it's essentially the same thing. You can't have everybody trying to use the same piece of exclusive property, the same scarce property, in different ways that all conflict with each other. That's why we have the concept of property rights, to lower the amount of conflict. But yeah, it's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, and there's going to be some misuses of it. But I think there's always ways to right those naturally without trying to get some outside authority or overriding authority to come in and change the fundamentals of the systems at play without understanding the implications. So anywho, yeah, we've talked about self-ownership. We've talked about property rights. We talk about how these are more interrelated. So we've already talked about how using self-ownership and extending the concept of, self-ownership, need to maintain your property, your person, leads to the need to supply yourself with, more material needs that you need to get from the physical world, or the virtual world in this case. That's why it's justified. But also, interestingly, so like I said, a lot of these principles are self-reinforcing. And there's one more that is very important, one of the most important. You've probably heard it before. It's called the non-aggression principle. This is one of the most important principles ever conceptualized, in my opinion. It's the idea that you don't have a right to initiate violence on other people. Like, I don't have a right to be, the second, third, fifth, or whoever, 100th person to show up at a piece of property and steal it by force. I wasn't the first one to make the claim. Who should have more claim to it than the guy who claimed it first and still has exclusive dominion over it? The only person who could have a better claim is the person who negotiates with him to trade for it, or the second person who finds it after the first person who finds it after it's been abandoned. And even then, that could, people have there's differences of opinion in some situations of real life over when something is actually abandoned. But in the game, it's extremely clear because of these pillars. When the pillars are gone, their claim is gone. It has been abandoned. It's back to a state of unclaimed nature where somebody else can now go and claim it in any way they want. They can build a pillar, they can build a big-ass base, they can build a wall. You don't know what they're going to build. So if you really don't want them to build a wall, or you really don't want them to build a mega base there, your only option is to instead build a pillar there. That's why pillars are so valuable, because there's a lot of things that we could all share. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Some of the implications of a strict adherence to individualism and property rights is there's all these opportunities for community sharing and charity that you wouldn't expect. A lot of people think that the concept of people caring for other people, people helping their neighbor, people being almost self-sacrificially charitable. I think that's going too far, but people think that these concepts are at odds with individualism or respect for property rights or capitalism, but they aren't. That's the only way they work, actually. The only way they work. The only way people can afford to be charitable. The only way they can have enough luxury and enough abundance to not be afraid, to have more to share, is for them to have their property rights respected in the first place. The only way people are going to produce in the first place is if they feel that their right to keep the fruits of their labor is protected. They won't produce if they know that they're going to be stolen from. Why would I spend my years toiling in the fields to grow crops if I know somebody else is just going to come and steal them after they're starting to bear fruit? That's it doesn't make sense. Nobody would do that. People don't do that. The only way people temporarily get people to do that is by threatening to kill them. But that only works for so long and to such a degree that they don't get killed. And you can't squeeze blood from a turnip either. You can't make people produce against their will, against their means, against their self-interest for very long at all. It won't work. And it doesn't work. It's never worked in the history of mankind. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people have died trying to get away with that violation of the laws of the physical realm. You can't force a person to work against their own interest at their expense as slavery. It just, people would some of them would often rather die, and some of them practically can't not die. I mean, you can't. It doesn't work. There's many reasons. I've touched on some of them. You have to incentivize production. You have to, and that's by property rights. The only way people are going to produce is if they have the right to do with what they want, the fruits of their labor. They can sell them, they can trade them, they can invest them. Yeah, so that leads to property rights. But let me get that leads to capital rights. Actually, let me get more into the concept of the non-aggression principle, though, because I didn't really fully flesh that out. The non-aggression principle says that you don't have a right to initiate violence. So you don't have a right to steal. You don't have a right to murder. It doesn't disqualify defensive force. That's a different beast conceptually. But yeah, you can see that a lot of what we've already been talking about seem to already include this. It violates their self-ownership while trying to assert yours, which is a contradiction. It violates their property rights while trying to assert yours, which is another contradiction. You can't steal their property and then claim you own their property and it should be free from being stolen, because you're still saying, I want my property rights respected, but I don't want your property rights respected. That's not mutual or property rights, because there's been forms of that since forever. But one of the best forms that we've found, one of the best ways of conceptualizing it and protecting it and understanding it is the homesteading principle in exclusive ownership. And so that's what's represented in the game by these pillars. That's why they're so important. That's why I get so annoyed when people don't understand them, lash out at them, cry for wildcard to get involved and delete them all. Basically, that's stealing everybody else's property. All the time and effort people have put in over the 2.5 years on this cluster to develop themselves in the world, protect what they need, to plan for the future, to figure out how they're going to invest and make their own way in this world, or just have and hold for trading later. You can buy stuff from people. If you want the pillars, buy them. I've bought pillars from people. I've sold pillars from people. And it works great when people just work within the system of the game, mutually, voluntarily trading and cooperating. It's almost too easy. The game's almost too easy. They designed it to be very harsh. They designed it to be ruthless, and it is pretty harsh and ruthless. But I mean, if you're working with a lot of a friendly community that helps each other out, and is willing to trade fairly or just give, pretty much. At this point, this community is so well off that people just give each other stuff. I haven't paid for anything on this server. Well, actually, that's not true. I traded one item. In the last probably year and a half on this server, and that's it. I bought this Therizino chibi from a guy. I traded him a Quetzal chibi, which is, I think, more rare, but I really wanted the Theri. But other than that, I mean, I've gotten new Theri lines, I've gotten new Rex lines, I've gotten a bunch of crafting materials, I've gotten to go on boss runs. I didn't pay for any of it, but meanwhile, I've given out just as much. I've taken people on boss runs, I've taken people on ascension runs, I've given other people Rexes, I've given some people some otters, I've given a whole bunch of other different tames. But at this point, everybody on the game is. We've reached the state where people don't. This is another one of these contradictions that people don't recognize exists in capitalism. This is a capitalistic game. You have an exclusive claim. You can build and you can invest. You can save. You can trade freely with no governing authority, with no taxes, none of that. And there's not even any safety nets to make sure you don't get scammed. That's how little governing authority there is. There's not even a dialogue box that makes sure the guy you just gave stuff to doesn't just run off with it and not give you anything. But still it works because it's mutually beneficial. It's mutually beneficial to every party, every time. That's why people do it. And it's worked so well for so long for so many people that we've reached a state of abundance and luxury on this harsh survival game where we just give each other stuff at this point. We value each other's company more than we value the items that we're just giving away, because we like playing with these people. We played with these people for a year or two in some cases, and I've seen this same scenario play out in every other harsh survival game I've played. You reach a point, this is what the socialists or communists like to call post-scarcity. And they think that they can somehow get there through socialism. They cannot get there through socialism. The only way to remotely approach the concept of post-scarcity is through capitalism. The only way. Because the only way you're ever going to get anywhere near the amount of production you need is if people realize that their rights are going to be protected. If they think their rights aren't going to be protected, they won't produce. And they'll be fearful. If they think their rights aren't going to be protected, they'll want to have more than they need, because there's a very high chance that they'll have whatever they have now be taken away, and then they'll need more. So if you protect the rights of people, you protect the rights of individuals, you have the moral principle that you can't have your property taken away, people will be less fearful. They'll know more predictably exactly how much they'll need, exactly when they have more than enough, and they'll realize they have well more than enough sooner, and they'll be much more willing to give to people they like. Because one of the other economics principles is the more abundant a resource is, the less value it appears to have. I mean, if I have one piece of meat and I'm a starving man, that one piece of meat is worth a lot, because otherwise I'm going to die. But if I have thousands of pieces of meat and I'm full, I don't really care about one piece of meat. That same one piece of meat that a second ago would have been very valuable to me is now relatively meaningless to me. So if I see a noob that I don't even know, he just said hi, he's worth pretty much nothing to me, but the small possibility that he might continue playing and maybe be a friend at some point. He says, hi, hey, I'm hungry. Do you have any food? If I'm also desperate and in need, it's not going to be worth the trade to try and give this guy the food. I need the food. But if I'm doing well, because my rights to produce and keep what I produced were protected, then I am gonna value his possibility of friendship higher than the piece of meat I don't even need. I give him the meat. That's how society works. That's how abundance works. That's how economics works. That's how post-scarcity is actually accomplished. It's not actual real post-scarcity. There's always going to be some resources that are still scarce, and even things that are extremely abundant, given the right circumstances, given a certain level of utilization, they will become scarce as well. There's always going to be something that's scarce, even if it's time or people's interest. Even people's interest could be a scarce resource, because one person's set of eyes can only look at so many things at a time, and when you have nothing else that you're really worried about getting, people, they're social creatures. They want to get the attention of others. I mean, it's famous, it's a powerful motivator for a lot of people. And so that's what people will want, and even that is scarce. That's always a factor. So there's no such thing as post-scarcity. But the only way to approach that idea is through capitalism. And let me talk a little bit more about what I mean by capitalism, because a lot of people have just the most far-off misconceptions of what that word means. Capital is just a form of property that can easily be traded. It can be invested. Anything that can be traded, invested, saved, or stored, or whatever, that's all capital. That's what capital is. That's all capital is. It's just property that you're not immediately consuming in some form that could potentially be used by somebody else in any way at any time later in the future. That's capital. So if you totally undermine the concept of capital rights entirely, you're basically saying that no one is even allowed to own more than the shirt on their back at any point in their lives. You just have to go wandering through the forest, essentially, trying to pick berries before somebody else does and cram them in your mouth before someone else says it's a form of capital. That's essentially what it really boils down to if you undermine the concept of capitalism. Because everything is a form of capital. Not everything, but I mean it's practically everything. Anything that's a form of property can almost be considered also a form of capital. And capitalism is simply respect for the rights of humans. It's a human right. It's a respect for a human right to own property, to trade it, to save it, to invest it, to utilize it however they see fit, even if you might also want it. But yeah, capitalism, it's a great concept. It's a very moral concept. But it does undermine what some people want to do. Some people want to steal. Some people want to enslave. This concept of capitalism is an obstacle to doing that. They don't want this concept to exist. They don't want people to understand their rights in such a way, because it makes it harder for them to steal. It makes it harder for them to enslave. It makes it harder for them to kill. It makes it harder for them to get over on the rest of society in a non-mutual way. So there's a whole lot of disinformation constantly always being spread about how bad capitalism is and what it is. People claim it lets you make people into property. You're not. Literally, capitalism is based on the concepts of self-ownership, which invalidates the concept of making other people your property. It's exactly the opposite of the claims that are made against it. But yeah, I'm not going to get any further into that. But yeah, I talked about a lot of the founding principles: self-ownership, property rights, the non-aggression principle. These things, they all interconnect to each other and intersupport each other. None of them contradict themselves. None of them contradict each other. They all support each other. Capital rights is a part of property rights. It's a natural extension of the concept. And the homesteading principle is the most obvious way we have ever conceived of establishing property rights in the first place. And from there you trade, mutually voluntary trade. That's the only form of trade that doesn't include aggression. It has to be mutually voluntary. Neither party can be coerced, because that's a violation of the non-aggression principle. So see how these things are all related? It makes a lot of sense. It seems very reasonable. The better these things are actually practiced, the better these rights are actually respected and adhered to, the more prosperous people are throughout history, throughout the entire world, throughout all history. The more rigorously people have protected property rights, the more consistently people have followed these principles, the more they've prospered. And the more they've tried to violate or live at odds with these terms of reality, the physical reality. These are all based on the physical terms of reality, the physical, laws that we see. Everything, every indication that we have about how the physical world works has led to these moral principles. And the more you try to live at odds with the laws of nature, the more you suffer. The less you'll have, the more people fight, the more people die, the more people are fearful, the more people have to try and get over on each other and steal each other's shit and kill each other. It's the same in the real world as on Ark. That's one of the things that's so amazing about this game. You can use it to kind of better understand human nature. You can better understand human behavioral patterns. You can see different philosophies at play. You can see the outcomes they lead to on a much quicker and smaller scale. It's really amazing. I've seen all the extremes on this game. It's really, you could write books about it, but I don't know who would read them. But yeah, I also wanted to talk about some of the surprising outcomes of following these systems. You don't really see them in real life, because rarely do people have enough abundance for some of these characteristics to really present themselves. People have theorized that you'd see them more, but the coolest thing about these video games is that you can see on a small scale and a small time frame a lot of these principles shaping the society much quicker, and then you can see the outcomes of such a society much sooner. And they're great. They're awesome. So I want to talk about some of them. So yeah, I've touched on some of them. Like people often seem to think that the most caring systems of government would be something communistic, where everybody's cared for by the state, the all-loving, caring, nurturing hand of the state. But we've never seen such a thing. We've never seen an all-loving, nurturing, caring state. Every time we've given the state enough power to take care of everybody, the more power they have to give, what they end up doing with it is just taking more. The less accountability we have, the more power they have, the more we get fucked, the more we lose. And it's happened every time, without fail. Every time, to the degree, the more power a government is given, the more it runs wild with power and destroys the people who were supporting it until it collapses. It's happened every time, without fail. I don't know how we could still be talking about this kind of thing hundreds of years later, after some of these concepts have been semi-codified as well as they can be by people who are completely irrational by any normal standard. But they've been carried out nonetheless, and every time they've exploded in everyone's face, to the detriment of hundreds of millions of people starving and dying, and just levels of horror that you don't even want to have to think about or recognize exist. They're so disturbing. And yet people have had to experience them and suffer them over and over, and people still advocate for those systems. It's really kind of mind-boggling. I mean, it's almost, you got to question whether people literally want to bring about their own demise at some base level. I don't know. I certainly don't, which is why I hate those concepts. Yeah, the concept of individual rights, property rights, these things lead to great outcomes. They lead to abundance, prosperity. They lead to charity. Yeah, so yeah, let me talk about some of that. Some of the things I've seen. Oh yeah, I was on the middle of a point and I totally lost the train, didn't I? Yeah, so I was talking about community rights, where the community's kind of taking care of people. Instead of an all-loving, nurturing state, supposedly, that never has existed, we have the community, which is individuals acting based on their own individual self-interests, but to the benefit of most of the community, which happens all the time on this server. This is my favorite server. And we got a lot of great people here. They're well off. They've managed to establish themselves quite some time ago. And there's not a lot to do in the game at the end game. I mean, you can do certain things. But some of the things they value the most is helping others. Because they like people. People like people. Generally, people, when they're not at odds with each other, when they're not fearful of each other, when they can trust each other, people love people. People love others in society. They feel safe. They feel comfortable. They feel, loved and appreciated. But if you design a society where everybody's trying to live at odds with everybody else, they don't feel any of those things. They don't feel trust. They feel afraid. They don't feel like they're secure. They feel like they could have all their things lost at any moment based on systematic changes they have no control over, or based on new laws or new enforcers of those laws who are going to, impose them in unfair ways. But yeah, you don't get that outcome. You get a totally different outcome. So if you have that individual rights protection, people feel secure rather than fearful of others. They feel appreciative of others instead. They want to help. They feel secure. They feel more hopeful. They feel more capable. They're much more likely to, invest their care to improve the world. But alternatively, if you set humanity at odds with each other, you set society all at odds with each other, they won't feel that care. They won't want to put forth the effort. It will seem more impossible. Some people will still try, but it's just fewer and fewer. Fewer and fewer will feel like it's worth the investment. But if you're unwilling to express any care, you're unwilling to make any investment in the world, you're never going to see what you want take shape. It's never going to happen. So, I mean, we need people to have an interest in positive outcomes. We need people to care about it. We need people to put forward the effort. And we need other people who might follow to see that and join in order to see positive change. And in the real world, it's risky, it's long-term, it's slow, and there's such a mountain to try and overcome. But in a video game, it's not as bad. You can see those changes take place. You can see the positive impacts on a much shorter time scale. It's great. It's a lot of fun to see. I've seen it all. I've seen the spontaneous order that I was talking about. I've seen the charity. I've seen the community helping the community. I've seen shared resources that never have really worked under like a communal concept of ownership, which doesn't even make sense. And so you normally wouldn't expect somebody who respects the concept of private ownership, individual ownership, to understand how certain community-owned, community-used resources might work well, but they do. And it's because of economics. I only have to invest one time in one teleporter. It takes up this one limited amount of space. And if I set it on public and the whole server can use it when it's not lagging, then there only needs to be one teleporter here. Jesus, that was a lot of lag. I failed. Oh shit, I'm in the middle of the swamp too. Let's see, I better get out of here before I get eaten. Oh shit, I'm getting eaten. How quickly the tables turn. Yeah, we fly around on these dragons, and you feel like you're disconnected from the harshness of the world as soon as something goes wrong. Now I'm on the ground and waiting for this jerk to land. I'm getting attacked by alligators. Without my tools, I'd be dead already. And it's the same in the real world. People don't realize how close we are to an early grave. Without the systems we've built up, without the infrastructure we've built up that we use on a daily basis, we would not do well. We would do very badly. We'd immediately need to start building new infrastructure to replace what we lost, or we would die. And it's the same in the game. Anyway, that's not the point I was trying to get into. I was talking about community property. And the reason why it works in a private ownership model. Here's a resource that everybody would want to use. This is the swamp. People do meat runs here. There's abundant wild animals here, but there's limited space. If everybody built here, it would take up all the space with builds, and there would be no wild animals. And nobody would really be able to get to it easily either. But instead, I pillared it all off so nobody else can build here. So all the wild animals are available for everyone to exploit. And I built this teleporter here. So everybody can teleport out here for free, utilize this property for free, get the benefit for free. And the reason why it benefits everyone, including me, who is the one who had to expend the most to make it happen, is because if everybody's getting their needs met for their meat runs in this one spot, that's less property that's needed around the rest of the map that I might want to use for other things, or that someone else might want to use for something else, and their need to use that space for that purpose would stop someone else from using the other space for another purpose. Basically, there ends up being more land for everyone, including me, as long as property that can be shared is shared in a, you know, not overburdensome way, with as light of a footprint as possible, which is what we have here. 1 times the investment for unlimited value to unlimited people. Rather than the alternative where if everybody was just wide open to be able to build these teleporters, it wouldn't, you know, I've seen other servers where there's 8 of these throughout the swamp, and you know, associated infrastructure around it, builds and stuff like that, blocking spawns, taking up a lot of space. None of them are public, and it costs everybody time, it costs everybody space, which takes away from the abundance. It leads to less prosperity. It's all economics. But yeah, it's great to see in the game. It's another one of the things that you wouldn't realize is likely to be very common in a more capitalistic world. More charity, more community aid, more community, you know, more public parks, more public resources, more public infrastructure, more public services. It's more likely under individual ownership model. Yeah, so it's pretty great. There's a lot of consequences that come out of rights protection that everybody wants to enjoy. Everyone realizes are positives. People just disagree on how to achieve them. The most reasonable, logical, obvious, direct way is through individual rights protection. It's the only way. I mean, some people seem to think it seems non-obvious, but it isn't really that non-obvious. It's very obvious. If you think about it this way, it's all about incentivizing production. If you protect people's property rights, they will feel safe to produce. The more people produce, the more you'll have. The more society has, the more prosperity, the more abundance is going to be. That's just, it's really that simple. And the more people are out there running around stealing, killing, and taking things from people, the less likely people are going to want to produce. If they think something's definitely going to be stolen from them, they're not going to want to produce. And if they do produce, they're not going to want to share. So you'll have less abundance. You'll have less production at all. You'll have less trade, which also leads to less abundance, because trade is it's a mutually value adding. People don't trade unless they both are going to benefit. If they're not forced to trade, and if they are forced to trade, it shouldn't really be called trade. So yeah, people don't trade unless they both expect to benefit. And that comes from the differences in relative value. I've talked about that already, where if I have 1 steak and I'm starving, it's worth a lot to me. But if I have 1,000 steaks and I'm not starving, it's not worth a lot to me. So the value, it's the same steak, it's exactly the same, you know, in the constituent way, its parts are the same, and the number of atoms is the same. Why does it have a different number? Why does it have a different value? It's because of my current need and the abundance that I have of it. And that's how it works. That's why everybody benefits when trade makes sense, and it makes sense when people feel safe to trade their excess for the excess of others. It even makes sense when they don't feel that safe to do so. But if they feel too unsafe to do the trading in the first place, they don't want to risk other people knowing what they even have, or they don't want to risk producing it in the first place. You just can't get the outcomes you want without respecting humanity. You have to respect human dignity. You can't make people into slaves to supposedly benefit people. You can't expect people to value other human beings if you demean them. So if you want people to respect and appreciate and love each other enough to be just, overflowingly charitable with them, which people claim they want to see. I want to see it. I've seen it on these small scales in video games, but I haven't seen it as much as I'd like in real life. I've seen it sometimes, but not a whole lot. Not as much as everybody would really, I think, like to see. I don't think the argument is that people would like to see that. People act like libertarians and whatnot are just these harsh, uncaring monsters who just don't care. No, I care a lot. I want to see positive outcomes. I want to see needs met. I want to see happy people. I want to see charity. I want to see prosperity. But I know the best way to see it is through protecting people's individual rights. I mean, why the hell else would somebody love and care enough about other people to want to give to them if they didn't value them? You have to care about people more than you care about your material abundance, which is easily possible if you just don't fear those people. If you don't, I've kind of labored this point over and over, but it's really that simple. It's very simple. It's very common. It's very common sense, easy to understand. Anyway, yeah, that's the first time I've really gotten into any kind of philosophical concept on this gaming channel. This is really one of the first times it's really been relevant. This argument about these pillars. So what it's really based on. This is a very foundational tool. It's very important. And that's really what's at stake. The value of the game itself is at stake. People, they take this away and they undermine our only tool to protect the rights of individuals on this game. You can't take them away without violating the rights of individuals on this game. And as soon as they're gone as a tool, nobody else who plays it after that fact can really assert any sort of claim on the land other than making these paved worlds of what? I don't even know how it would work. It doesn't make sense how it could even work in the game. If you're not allowed to what? You're not allowed to build structures anymore? What are they going to have? Like one lot you can build? I mean, I've seen other games do that, like on Minecraft, but they didn't have anything like the form that this game has taken. They just wouldn't be Ark. They wouldn't be anything like Ark. And I really like the way this game works now. I think all the people who are playing it mostly really like the way this game is now. Or else, why are they still playing it? Anywho, so those are my thoughts on it. I kind of went on at a lot of length, but I think these are very important concepts. They're not just important to the game. They're important in real life. They're not well respected in real life. They're partially respected in real life in different areas to different degrees. But yeah, I think I've shared some pretty helpful concepts, some food for thought, and how it relates to the game, how the game relates to the world. I hope somebody enjoyed it. Have a good one. I'll see you next time. Peace.